Comment where you're watching from today, as we share a story about how unexpected kindness can emerge from life's most painful moments. At St. Mary's Cathedral in downtown Los Angeles, the morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that danced across white rose petals strewn along the aisle. It was supposed to be the perfect June wedding, meticulously planned over 18 months by Isabella Richardson and her fiancé Lucas Hayes. But sometimes life has other plans, and sometimes heroes appear in the most unexpected places. Jason Statham hadn't planned on attending a wedding that morning. He'd simply been driving past the cathedral on his way to a meeting when something made him pause. Perhaps it was the gathering crowd outside, or maybe it was the look of concern on the face of Carmen Alvarez, the wedding planner, as she paced back and forth while speaking urgently into her phone. Inside the bride's room, Isabella Richardson sat in her wedding dress, a custom-made gown that had taken months to perfect. Her sister Victoria, the maid of honor, was adjusting the veil while trying to hide her growing anxiety. The ceremony should have started 15 minutes ago, but no one had heard from the groom. Oliver Foster, Lucas's best man, had been making excuses about traffic and a misplaced boutonniere, but his face told a different story. He kept checking his phone, his expression growing more desperate with each passing minute. Carmen Alvarez noticed this from across the room, her years of experience telling her that something was very wrong. Reverend Paul Andrews stood at the church entrance, greeting guests while discreetly checking his watch. He'd performed hundreds of weddings in his 20 years of ministry, and he recognized the signs of impending heartbreak. Still, he continued to smile and welcome guests, including a casually dressed man who had quietly slipped in through the side door, Jason Statham. Diana Richardson, the mother of the bride, was doing her best to maintain composure as she explained to guests that there would be a slight delay. Her husband Gregory paced the vestibule, his rental tuxedo suddenly feeling too tight as he watched his daughter's perfect day begin to unravel. Sofia Martinez, one of the bridesmaids, had known Isabella since college. She watched her friend through the partially open door, saw how she kept smoothing her dress with trembling hands, saw how she checked her phone every few seconds, still believing there must be a reasonable explanation for Lucas's delay. Nathan Brooks, the church coordinator, had started quietly consulting with Lauren Patel from the reception venue about their contingency options. 20 minutes had stretched to 30, and the whispers among the guests were growing louder. Daniel Ramirez, the photographer, had stopped taking pictures, sensing that this story might not have the ending everyone had hoped for. Claire Winters, the wedding singer, sat quietly at the piano, occasionally playing soft melodies to fill the increasingly uncomfortable silence. She caught Statham's eye as he found a seat in the back pew, both of them watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Robert and Marie Collins, who had known Isabella since she was a child, exchanged worried glances. They'd been married for 40 years and had seen enough of life to recognize when something was terribly wrong. Marie reached for her husband's hand, her heart breaking for the bride who still didn't know what they all were beginning to suspect. At the 45-minute mark, Oliver Foster finally received the text message everyone had been dreading. His face went pale as he read it, then reread it, hoping somehow the words would change. With trembling hands, he showed the message to Carmen Alvarez, who closed her eyes briefly before straightening her shoulders. Someone would have to tell Isabella. Victoria Richardson knew something was wrong the moment Carmen entered the bride's room. The wedding planner's professional mask was still in place, but there was a gentleness in her eyes that spoke of bad news. Isabella, catching their expressions in the mirror, slowly turned around. "He's not coming, is he?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. The question hung in the air like delicate glass, about to shatter. Carmen glanced at Victoria, then back at Isabella. "No, sweetheart. He's not." The next few moments seemed to move in slow motion. Isabella sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, the $50,000 wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume in a play that had ended too soon. Victoria knelt beside her sister, while outside the door, Carmen quickly mobilized her team to begin the difficult task of informing guests and managing the aftermath. Jason Statham watched as the news rippled through the congregation. He saw how Eleanor Wright, a close family friend, immediately moved to intercept Diana Richardson, who looked like she might collapse. He observed how Reverend Andrews quietly directed his staff to provide privacy and support to the family. Gregory Richardson stood at the entrance to the bride's room, his hand on the doorknob, unsure whether to go in. His daughter had always been strong, independent, the kind who handled her own problems. But how does a father protect his child from this kind of pain? Sofia Martinez and the other bridesmaids formed a protective circle around the bride's room, shielding Isabella from well-meaning but intrusive guests. Daniel Ramirez had put away his camera, understanding that some moments shouldn't be documented. The text message, as Oliver Foster would later reveal, was brief and cowardly. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." Lucas Hayes, the man who had spent a year and a half planning a future with Isabella, had decided at the last moment that he couldn't follow through. He didn't even have the courage to say it in person. Lauren Patel was already making calls to cancel the reception, while Nathan Brooks began quietly ushering guests toward the exits. The Collins couple lingered, wanting to help but not knowing how, their own 4 decades of marriage making this moment even more poignant. Through it all, Jason Statham remained in his pew, watching as a day meant for joy transformed into one of heartbreak. Something about Isabella's quiet dignity in the face of such public humiliations struck a chord with him. He'd played tough guys in movies, but this young woman was showing real strength. Finally, Isabella emerged from the bride's room. Her makeup was intact, her posture straight, but her eyes held a pain that seemed too big for words. Victoria held her hand tightly as they prepared to walk back down the aisle, not as part of a celebration, but as a retreat. Let us know in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone face heartbreak with extraordinary grace. How did they handle it? Because what Jason Statham did next would remind everyone present that sometimes the most powerful moments of humanity come when we're brave enough to help someone through their darkest hour. As Isabella Richardson prepared to make the most difficult walk of her life, back down the aisle she was supposed to travel as a bride, Jason Statham made a decision that would transform this moment of heartbreak into something entirely unexpected. The action star rose from his pew just as Isabella and Victoria reached the church's main aisle. The whispers among the remaining guests suddenly shifted from sympathy for the bride to recognition of the famous face in their midst. But Statham paid no attention to the murmurs. His focus was entirely on the young woman in white who was trying so hard to maintain her dignity. Carmen Alvarez, who had managed countless wedding crises in her career, watched with professional interest as Statham approached Isabella. There was something in his demeanor, not the tough guy persona from his films, but a genuine warmth that made everyone pause. "Miss Richardson," he said quietly, his distinctive voice carrying in the hushed church, "would you allow me to walk with you?" The simple offer, made without pity or condescension, seemed to catch Isabella off guard. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. Victoria, still holding her sister's hand, felt Isabella's fingers relax slightly. There was something about Statham's presence, solid, calm, unpretentious, that seemed to create a buffer between Isabella and the crushing weight of her public humiliation. Gregory and Diana Richardson watched from the side, unsure how to react as the action star offered their daughter his arm. Diana, who had been barely holding herself together, saw something shift in her daughter's expression, not happiness, but perhaps the first hint that survival was possible. "The thing about moments like these," Statham said, speaking just loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "is that they reveal who the strong ones really are." His words weren't just empty comfort. There was a conviction in them that made everyone present reconsider what they were witnessing. Eleanor Wright, who had known Isabella since she was a child, watched as the bride straightened her shoulders and placed her hand on Statham's offered arm. Victoria maintained her position on Isabella's other side, creating a protective formation that transformed the walk of shame into something more like a procession of dignity. Reverend Andrews, observing from the altar, would later remark that he had never seen someone handle such a devastating moment with more grace, both the bride and her unexpected escort. As they moved down the aisle, Statham's presence seemed to deflect the pitying stares, turning them instead into looks of respect. Daniel Ramirez, the photographer, found himself lifting his camera again, not to document tragedy but to capture something extraordinary. The image he caught, Isabella flanked by Statham and Victoria, her head held high despite her tears, would later become a symbol of resilience that would touch thousands. Sofia Martinez and the other bridesmaids fell in behind them, their formation shifting from wedding party to honor guard. Oliver Foster, still holding the phone with Lucas's cowardly message, watched in amazement as the moment transformed from devastating to almost empowering. As they approached the church doors, Lauren Patel rushed forward to handle the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered outside. But Statham had already considered this. With a few quiet words into his phone, his security team appeared, creating a protective barrier between Isabella and any prying eyes or cameras. Robert and Marie Collins, who had seen 4 decades of marriages and their various trials, observed how Statham handled each step with a perfect balance of respect and protectiveness. "That's a real gentleman," Robert whispered to his wife, who nodded in agreement. Outside, Carmen Alvarez had already arranged for cars to be brought around, but Statham had a different suggestion. "There's a quiet place nearby," he said to Isabella, "where you can take a moment to breathe before facing everything else. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is take time to gather our strength." Nathan Brooks overheard this exchange and quickly coordinated with the church staff to ensure privacy and security. He'd managed many weddings, but never one quite like this. The action star's intervention had somehow shifted the entire atmosphere from tragedy to something more complex and meaningful. Claire Winters, who had been meant to sing at the ceremony, found herself humming softly as she gathered her music, not the wedding march, but something more fitting for this moment of unexpected grace. The melody caught Statham's ear, and he nodded in appreciation of her intuitive understanding. Isabella, who hadn't spoken since receiving the news, finally found her voice. "Why?" she asked Statham softly. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" His response was characteristic of the man who had built his career on actions rather than words. "Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones who need someone in their corner the most. And strength like yours deserves respect." Gregory Richardson, watching his daughter handle this moment with such grace, felt a complex mixture of emotions: rage at Lucas, grief for his daughter's pain, but also a growing appreciation for how this unexpected guardian had helped transform the narrative of the day. Diana Richardson, who had been on the verge of collapse, found herself drawing strength from her daughter's example and Statham's steady presence. She approached them, her mother's heart both broken and swelling with pride at Isabella's dignity. Victoria, still holding her sister's hand, saw how Statham's intervention had done something remarkable. It had given Isabella a choice about how this story would be told. Not as the bride who was left at the altar, but as the woman who faced heartbreak with extraordinary grace, supported by an unexpected ally. Let us know in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone step in at exactly the right moment to transform a situation from devastating to bearable. What did they do? How did it change things? Because what happened next would show that sometimes the most powerful acts of kindness come from simply giving someone the space and support to find their own strength. The quiet place Jason Statham had mentioned turned out to be a private garden behind a nearby historic hotel. As Isabella Richardson settled onto an ornate bench, still in her wedding dress, the action star's security team ensured their privacy while maintaining a respectful distance. The contrast between this peaceful sanctuary and the chaos they'd left behind at the church was striking. Victoria sat beside her sister, while Carmen Alvarez efficiently managed the logistics of cancellations and notifications through hushed phone calls at the garden's edge. Statham had made some calls of his own, and soon Eleanor Wright arrived with a change of clothes for Isabella, something comfortable but elegant, a small but significant step toward reclaiming her dignity. "You know," Statham said, breaking the contemplative silence, "I've faced some tough moments in my life. But what you did back there, walking out with your head high, that's real strength." His words carried the weight of someone who understood that true power often comes in quiet moments of dignity rather than grand gestures. Diana Richardson, who had joined them in the garden, watched as her daughter slowly began to process what had happened. The mother in her wanted to rush forward, to somehow fix everything, but Statham's calm presence seemed to create a space where everyone could breathe, where healing could begin at its own pace. Sofia Martinez arrived with coffee and pastries, not because anyone was particularly hungry, but because sometimes normal routines can be anchoring in moments of chaos. She'd also brought Isabella's phone, which had been flooded with messages of support from guests who had witnessed her graceful exit. "I keep thinking," Isabella said softly, looking down at her elaborate dress, "about all the plans we made. All the future we mapped out. How do you just walk away from that?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of 18 months of dreams suddenly shattered. Statham considered her words carefully before responding. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding on, it's letting go with grace. And you've already shown more grace than most people manage in a lifetime." Daniel Ramirez, who had been discreetly documenting the day's events, captured a moment that would later become iconic. Isabella, still in her wedding dress but with a different kind of strength in her posture, listening intently as Statham shared stories from his own journey from market stall worker to global star. Lauren Patel arrived with news about the reception venue. They had offered to transform the space into something entirely different, not a wedding celebration, but perhaps a gathering of support, a demonstration that endings can also be beginnings. Isabella considered this, finding strength in the idea of facing her guests on her own terms. "The hardest part," Victoria observed, watching her sister's transformation, "isn't the heartbreak itself. It's feeling like you've lost control of your own story." Statham nodded in agreement, understanding how public moments of pain can take on a life of their own. Gregory Richardson, who had been quietly seething with paternal anger, found himself gradually shifting focus from his rage at Lucas to pride in his daughter's resilience. Watching her interact with Statham, not as a starstruck fan but as someone finding her footing in a moment of crisis, he began to see a strength in her he'd never fully appreciated before. Claire Winters, who had followed them to the garden, began softly humming a different tune, not a wedding march or a love song, but something that spoke of resilience and new beginnings. The melody seemed to shift the energy in the garden, turning it from a hiding place into a space of transformation. Robert and Marie Collins arrived with a surprising gift, a photo album, not of wedding pictures, but of Isabella throughout her life. "To remind you," Marie said gently, "that your story didn't begin with him, and it certainly doesn't end with him." As Isabella changed out of her wedding dress, Statham shared more of his own story, not the public version, but the real one, about moments of doubt and rejection, about plans that fell apart and dreams that had to be rebuilt. His words carried no judgment, no pity, just the understanding of someone who knew that sometimes life's worst moments can lead to unexpected strength. Carmen Alvarez, ever the professional, had been quietly transforming the reception space as they talked. When she showed Isabella photos of the new setup on her phone, the bride's eyes widened. Gone were the wedding decorations, replaced by something more powerful, a celebration of resilience, of community, of moving forward. "You have a choice now," Statham said, watching Isabella's reaction. "You can let this moment define you, or you can define the moment. Either way, you've already shown more courage than the man who couldn't face you today." Oliver Foster arrived, still carrying the weight of having been the bearer of bad news. But instead of finding a scene of devastation, he found something unexpected, a gathering of strength, a moment of transformation. The way Statham had helped shift the narrative made him realize that sometimes support comes from the most unexpected places. Eleanor Wright, who had watched Isabella grow up, saw something new emerging in the young woman. Not just survival, but the beginning of something stronger. The way she held herself now, even in casual clothes, spoke of someone who had found an inner core of steel. Sofia Martinez had been sharing carefully selected photos on social media, not of heartbreak, but of strength. The image of Isabella walking out of the church between Statham and Victoria had already gone viral, but not as a scandal. Instead, it had become a symbol of grace under pressure, of finding strength in unexpected places. "You know what's interesting?" Statham mused, watching Isabella interact with her support system. "In my films, strength is usually about fighting back. But sometimes, like today, it's about standing tall and choosing your own path forward." Nathan Brooks arrived with news that the church had been cleared, the guests informed, everything handled with dignity. But more importantly, he brought a message from Reverend Andrews, an offer to hold a different kind of ceremony whenever Isabella was ready, not a wedding, but a celebration of new beginnings. As the afternoon progressed, something remarkable happened in that garden. What had started as a refuge from humiliation had transformed into a space of empowerment. Isabella, surrounded by support and understanding, began to see beyond the day's pain to the strength it had revealed in her. Let us know in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone turn their darkest moment into a source of strength. How did they do it? What helped them find their way forward? Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the end of one dream can be the beginning of something even more meaningful. As the sun began to set on what was supposed to be Isabella Richardson's wedding day, something extraordinary was happening at the reception venue. The space that had been meticulously decorated for a wedding celebration had been transformed into something entirely different, a gathering that would celebrate strength, resilience, and the power of unexpected kindness. Jason Statham, who had started the day as an accidental witness to heartbreak, now stood at the entrance of the transformed venue, greeting guests alongside Isabella. She wore an elegant blue dress that Eleanor Wright had brought her, a powerful statement that this was no longer about being a bride, but about being herself. "Ready?" Statham asked quietly as the first guests began to arrive. Isabella squared her shoulders, a small smile playing at her lips. "Ready," she replied, and there was a new confidence in her voice that hadn't been there hours before. Carmen Alvarez had outdone herself with the venue's transformation. Gone were the wedding tables and traditional decorations. Instead, the space had been arranged to encourage conversation and connection. The wedding cake had been replaced with an array of desserts, each tagged with notes about new beginnings and strength. Victoria watched her sister with pride as Isabella greeted each guest, not with embarrassment or pain, but with genuine appreciation for their support. The story of how Jason Statham had stepped in at the church had spread, and the gathering had taken on an almost magical quality, a reminder that sometimes life's worst moments can lead to its most meaningful ones. Daniel Ramirez, the photographer, captured moments throughout the evening that told a different story than the one he'd expected to document. Instead of traditional wedding photos, he caught instances of genuine connection, of strength, of a community coming together to support one of their own. Claire Winters had reworked her musical selections, choosing songs about resilience and self-discovery. When she performed "Rise Up," the emotion in the room was palpable. Isabella, standing between her parents, held their hands tightly as the lyrics spoke to something deep within her. Robert and Marie Collins, who had been married for 40 years, approached Isabella with wisdom earned through decades together. "Sometimes," Marie said gently, "the bravest thing is recognizing when something isn't right and having the courage to face that truth. Lucas's cowardice today revealed your strength." Sofia Martinez had been documenting the evening on social media, and something unexpected had begun to happen. Women from around the world were sharing their own stories of overcoming heartbreak, of finding strength in difficult moments. Isabella's story had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the events of the day. Gregory and Diana Richardson watched their daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. The way she carried herself now, engaging with guests and sharing genuine moments of connection, showed them a side of her they'd never fully appreciated before. "You see," Statham said to Isabella during a quiet moment, "strength isn't about never getting knocked down. It's about how you get back up. And you, love, have shown everyone here what that looks like." Eleanor Wright overheard this exchange and was struck by how perfectly it captured the transformation she'd witnessed. The desperate hurt of the morning had given way to something more powerful, a young woman discovering her own worth, independent of anyone else's actions or choices. Lauren Patel, who had helped coordinate the venue's transformation, found herself moved by the speeches that began to flow naturally as the evening progressed. Each person who spoke touched on different aspects of strength, resilience, and the power of community. Oliver Foster, who had dreaded attending after being the bearer of bad news, found himself welcomed into the gathering. His honest admission of how difficult it had been to deliver Lucas's message, and his immediate support of Isabella afterward, had earned him a different kind of respect. Nathan Brooks, observing from the back of the room, realized he was witnessing something rare, a moment when a community came together not just to support someone in pain, but to celebrate their strength in facing it. As the evening progressed, Statham shared more stories from his own journey, Not just the successes but the setbacks and doubts as well. His words carried extra weight because they came from a place of genuine understanding rather than mere sympathy. "The thing about movies," he said to the gathered guests, "is that we script every moment, plan every scene. But real strength? That's what happens when the script gets thrown out, and you have to write your own story on the spot." That's what Isabella did today. The wedding gifts that had been delivered to the venue were quietly set aside, to be dealt with later. Instead, guests had brought different kinds of presents: books about empowerment, journals for new beginnings, and heartfelt letters sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity. Carmen Alvarez, who had seen countless weddings in her career, realized that this gathering had achieved something more meaningful than many traditional ceremonies. It had transformed a moment of potential devastation into a celebration of human resilience. As the evening drew to a close, Isabella stood to address her guests. Her voice was clear and strong as she thanked them not just for their support, but for helping her see that sometimes life's most painful moments can lead to its most powerful transformations. "Today didn't go as planned," she said, with Statham standing supportively nearby, "but maybe it went exactly as it needed to. Instead of celebrating a marriage, we're celebrating something more important: the strength we find in ourselves and each other when things fall apart." Victoria watched her sister with tears in her eyes, remembering the devastated bride of the morning and seeing now a woman who had found something more valuable than the marriage she'd lost. She'd found herself. The final surprise of the evening came when Statham announced that he wanted to share something with everyone present. He spoke about a foundation he supported that helped people rebuild their lives after unexpected setbacks. In Isabella's honor, he was establishing a new program specifically focused on helping people find strength in their moments of greatest challenge. "Sometimes," he said, looking directly at Isabella, "the most powerful stories aren't about the happy endings we plan, but about the strength we find when those plans fall apart. Today, I witnessed that kind of strength, and it's reminded me what real power looks like." As guests began to leave, each one taking with them a small card that read, "Strength isn't about never falling, it's about how we rise," Isabella found herself feeling something unexpected: gratitude. Not for the pain or betrayal, but for the revelation of her own resilience and the extraordinary kindness of a stranger who had helped her find it. The day that had begun with a bride's heartbreak had ended with something far more powerful: a celebration of human strength, dignity, and the unexpected ways that kindness can transform our darkest moments into opportunities for growth. Let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced a moment when something that seemed like an ending became a different kind of beginning. How did you find the strength to move forward? Who helped you see your own power? Because sometimes the most beautiful stories aren't about the love we find in others, but about the strength we discover in ourselves.